Okay, so I'm going to do this class outside today. I thought I'd take a brief break from the introduction to Yangsheng classes that I've been doing the last 2 days. We'll get back to that tomorrow. But today I wanted to cover very briefly a concept which I think is quite useful for understanding whether we're interested in Yangsheng, supporting our own lives, and listening to our bodies to support our lifestyle, or we're a medical practitioner, a Chinese medicine practitioner, to understand one of the ways that the kidneys can get a little bit out of balance. I had a good friend contact me today who was in a little bit of a tricky spot, and with he might not have thought of it this way, but to me, with relationship to his kidneys, and was just talking about struggling with kind of feeling like he was in sort of survival mode a lot of the time, which I think a lot of people in the modern world feel. I certainly have struggled with my kidneys and that feeling of being caught in survival mode various times in my life, and this. So I in part want to review this, to review it for myself, even kind of a learning together sort of thing. But yeah, I was just thinking about this friend, and thinking about the ways that this survival mentality can kind of grip us, and we can get stuck in fight or flight mode, and how that unfolds from a Chinese medicine perspective, and maybe how we can work with it a little bit. So yeah, so I'm just going to do it out here. I didn't have time to put together a PowerPoint or anything, but I got my little nifty whiteboard here. Hopefully you can see it. So briefly, before we really get into the main topic, let's just review kind of what are the kidneys in Chinese medicine. And this came up actually after the class I did yesterday. A colleague asked me, a colleague who's familiar with some Chinese medicine but is relatively new to the field, asked me some questions about the organs in Chinese medicine, the different organ systems, and we were looking at the organ clock together. And one thing I found myself explaining, which I really wish had been explained to me in my first few days studying Chinese medicine, but unfortunately it didn't really fully take hold, this understanding, until multiple years into grad school, actually, was the way in which basically the fact that when we say kidney, when we say spleen, when we say liver in Chinese medicine, it is almost completely unhelpful to think of those designations as referring to the anatomical organs as we conceive of them in modern Western medical culture, basically. Which is not to say that there aren't overlaps. Of course, the anatomical liver is part of the liver system in Chinese medicine. The anatomical kidneys are part of the kidney system in Chinese medicine. Arguably, the anatomical spleen is maybe not so much part of the spleen system, which is the P in Chinese. But basically, we have to think of these in completely different ways. And part of the confusion of all this is there's sort of historical confusion to it in some ways. The spleen, I think, is a really good example. So why do we say spleen when we talk about this in Chinese medicine, talking about the spleen as though it's a digestive organ? The Chinese word is pi. The reason is that the spleen used to figure into actually Western medicine quite heavily when the dominant forms of Western medicine were humoral medicines. And humoral medicines, for those of you that don't know, are in some ways much more similar. Western humoral medicines, going back to ancient Greece, Hippocrates and Galen, much more similar in many ways to Chinese medicine, and certainly to traditional medicines throughout the world. In fact, most medical traditions around the world could be classified broadly as humoral, in the sense that they classify things in this particular way and think of the body as a balance of these different kind of subtle energies, which are connected to each of them connected to particular organs, particular fluids in the body, particular tissues, and that sort of a thing, and even connected to certain temperaments, certain aspects of mind and awareness. As I have mentioned, Western medicine is kind of unique in amongst medical traditions in its dualism, in the way that it tends to conceive of the physical body largely separate from its understanding of the mind and emotions. Most other medical traditions around the world, as strange as it sounds today, actually understood that the various different tissues and fluids and viscera in our body were linked with our psycho-emotional state. So, for instance, as we'll be talking about today, the kidneys in Chinese medicine are connected to fear, basically. Fear is a manifestation of imbalance of the kidneys and also a cause of imbalance of the kidneys, the kidney system. So anyway, going back to the case of the spleen, just because I think it's interesting, in humoral medicine, the spleen actually played a pretty significant role. And so when early medical missionaries went to China, Christian missionaries, and they came into contact with Chinese medicine, they saw this particular digestive organ, and they translated it as spleen because spleen was relevant to them in their medical paradigm at the time. As Western anatomy developed and Western anatomy kind of took hold of Western medicine, because it hasn't always been that way. As strange as it sounds today, the obsession with anatomy and the body as it's disclosed upon dissection is actually really unique to modern Western medicine. You don't find it in medical traditions so much elsewhere in the world, which isn't to say that other medical traditions didn't think about the body as it's disclosed through dissection a little bit, but not like modern Western medicine, which defines the body in that way. And at some point I'll do a class on the history of that, because I think it's quite interesting, and I have some thoughts about kind of why that is. So anyway, but then once the spleen became anatomically defined primarily, as opposed to defined according to this humoral paradigm, it really made no more sense to translate the Chinese P as spleen. The spleen in Chinese medicine, P, actually relates to the solar plexus region and is a center of digestion, is the central kind of energy of digestion, which extracts nutrients from food, processes it, and ascends it actually to be made into zheng qi, qi that's circulated through the whole body. Now, so clearly there's no exact correlation with any particular kind of specific organ in Western medicine that correlates directly with the spleen in Chinese medicine. And certainly the spleen in Western medicine isn't even really tangentially related to digestion at best. So we kind of have to understand this. And of course, in Chinese medicine, like these humoral theories, each of the viscera, like I said, is linked with an aspect of mind, an aspect of awareness and consciousness. And that is obviously very, very important. Because the viscera of Chinese medicine are so radically different than the anatomical organs of Western medicine, in the writing that I've done, and certainly in my teaching, I don't even like to use the word organ for them. The word organ, actually etymologically, I believe is from the 14th or 15th century, and it is linked with the idea of a tool that one might use. Now, this metaphor of an organ as a tool fits nicely with a kind of dualist conception of the body, where we think of the self as kind of being in the head or even not being embodied at all, and kind of using the body as though it's sort of a puppet, this kind of very Cartesian dualist framework. The idea that the organs are tools that somebody is using, you know what I mean, that the self is using. This term organ is more recent than the word viscera. The word viscera is ancient and is connected to the viscus of the ancient Greeks, so is used and connected to these humoral traditions, which, like I said, are much more similar to Chinese medicine in their character. And so I prefer to use the word viscera to refer to the zong fu of Chinese medicine. Now, zong fu is often translated as organ and bowel. I think viscera and bowel is probably better. Bowel isn't a bad translation for fu because the fu are kind of hollow. The fu are the yang viscera, the zong are the yin viscera. However, just as a whole, I would refer to the zong fu as viscera, not as organs. And the reason, of course, is because the word viscera still has a connection to a non-dualist way of thinking about the of human physiology, basically. A non-dualist way of thinking of human physiology. And what I mean by this is the word viscera, because it, of course, historically in the West was connected to these humoral traditions, we still use the word viscera to refer to more than just a physical thing, you know? An organ is just a physical thing. It's just I can pop out my liver and show it to you, there's my liver, it's a physical thing. In Chinese medicine, the liver is not just a physical thing, right? The liver system includes the anatomical liver, but it also includes the diaphragm. In some ways, the diaphragm is even more important for the liver system in Chinese medicine than the anatomical liver itself is, but also includes aspects of mind. It includes fluids in the body, certain fluids. It includes a connection with certain senses, with the visual sense. It includes a particular type of kind of tension in the tissues, which is related to the liver, and of course it relates to and includes certain aspects of mind and consciousness, the hun, which is the kind of aspect of awareness or consciousness, the filter through which awareness is passed, that relates to the liver. So this word viscera, I think, is much more appropriate, and we still see this in the use of the word viscera. We say visceral, you know, and when I say, oh, that was a visceral experience, right? It is a lived experience, a visceral thing. Visceral meaning I feel it. It's a lived experience. I feel it in my viscera, but I'm feeling it. There's an emotional quality potentially. There's a sort of whole somatic felt tone. The word viscera refers to a lived embodied experience, whereas the word organ relates to and refers to an object, a physical object that can be disclosed upon dissection. And so for this reason, I like the word viscera. I think it's better. Other translators, there's a famous early Chinese medicine scholar who translated instead the viscera of Chinese medicine as orbs. He said orbs, and he came up with his whole own idea about what an orb is and why orb is better than organ, to refer to the kind of energetics of it or something like that. I think that's okay. You could create your own word, but we actually already have a word in English that's really quite appropriate for talking about the physiology of Chinese medicine, and it is this word viscera. And again, this to me stresses the fact that a viscera is something that is related to the lived experience of being a body, which it's my understanding, and this will be a theme throughout my teaching, that Chinese medicine is about the body as a lived experience, right? The body as a person, as I was talking about in a recent class, as opposed to the body as an abstract object perceived purely from a third person perspective. So anyway, a bit of an aside, but just to kind of lay the groundwork for our discussion of one of the viscera of Chinese medicine, which is the kidneys. And now the kidneys, of course, refer to more, like I said, than just the anatomical organ of the kidneys. Of course, the anatomical organ is included. And if you look at ancient Chinese medical diagrams, actually, they are very sketch-like, very fluid. They don't have any pretensions to be literal, these ancient diagrams. If you if you look them up, they're quite beautiful and almost some of them kind of cartoon-like. And many of the viscera are represented in ways that look nothing like Western anatomy. Like the lungs look like a canopy of leaves, as does the liver sometimes. The kidneys, though, actually, they kind of look like anatomical kidneys. They have the same kind of shape in those diagrams. But we see in those diagrams they are essentially connected to the spine. And this is really important because in Chinese medicine, the spine is part of the kidney system, as is the marrow, the bone marrow. The kidneys really, in Chinese medicine, include so many different systems. They include the spine and big parts of they affect the nervous system, of course. The adrenals. Early when I was studying Chinese medicine, people would often say, well, actually the kidneys in Chinese medicine are more similar to the adrenal glands, there's some truth to that, certainly, because of kidney yang is very much analogous with, in certain cases, the adrenal function. We have the spine. They're connected to the perineum and also to the reproductive organs. So they are very much connected with, in women, the uterus, although the uterus is technically considered a mysterious fu, one of the kind of stranger, not the normal Zongfu, all of which are actually connected to the kidneys because they have a relationship with the Jing. The Jing, of course, being the kind of densest energetic substance of the body on a spectrum with Jing, Qi, and Shen, which I'll talk about another time. But basically, the kidneys functionally are connected to large processes of growth and development and maturity, and they sort of store they're related to our Ming, our life path, and our genetic programming. So there's a lot to be said about the kidneys. The kidneys, like I said, also in terms of the body, related to the perineum at the base and related to the brain at the top. And there's a lot to be said about that, but it's not really relevant so much to this discussion. What's more relevant to this discussion is to understand that the kidneys, when they're out of balance, tend to manifest fear. So in Chinese medicine, many of you will know that each of the 5 phases, the 5 elements, is linked with a different viscera, or actually multiple different viscera. In this case, this is the water element. The water phase is the kidneys, which is their yang pair is the bladder. And each of these phases, each of these elements, is connected to when it gets out of balance in the body, I should say, manifests as a particular emotion or emotional quality. And for the kidneys and the water phase, this is fear. And it's important to understand what we mean by fear. What we mean specifically is fear of survival. So fear of not surviving. It's a survival instinct. It's a kind of deep libidinal sort of drive and a kind of survival instinct. So whenever there is some sense of perceived threat to our survival, the kidneys kick in. And what kicks in when we perceive a threat to our survival is the kidney yang. The kidney yang. So we've got the famous Tai Chi symbol here, right? So we've got yang rising on the left and yin descending on the right. The left and right thing is actually quite important. A lot of people don't realize, and maps onto the way that qi circulates in the body. So we have yang and yin, and there's a yin of the kidneys and a yang of the kidneys. Now, the yang of the kidneys is what is sparked whenever we are in some kind of a situation where we feel our survival is threatened. It could be linked in some ways to adrenaline, of course, but you could probably link it to a lot of other hormones too. It's always suspicious to make too much of a one-to-one correlation with any aspect of the endocrine system and a Chinese medical concept. But but basically, it is the yang of the kidneys which is sparked, and so we become kind of vigilant. We become aware of what's going on, and this is very useful, right? We need to have this part of our being, right? We need to survive. The kidneys are essentially connected to survival, and they're in some ways the part of our system that gauges survival, both survival of ourself, but also even survival of the species, because, like I said, in Chinese medicine, the kidneys are essentially linked with the process of reproduction and the reproductive organs. So anything that, what is probably more, even more accurate to say than the kidneys are stimulated by anything that threatens our survival, it's anything that threatens our sense of identity or anything that we identify with. So you see this, the kidneys could be sparked even if someone is not necessarily, let's say I feel a need to protect my current favorite political actor, my chosen candidate for presidency, right? Maybe I feel that it's really important that this particular person becomes elected, and if they don't, I'm afraid that I'm not going to survive, my kids aren't going to survive, our country's not going to survive, and that the whole world is going to fall to pieces, which it seems to me a lot of people are thinking along those lines these days. If we perceive things that way, right? Not to knock that way of perceiving things, there's reasons. People have their reasons, but if we perceive things that way, then our kidneys are going to be stimulated when we're hanging out with a friend, and all of a sudden they say something critical of our candidate. And they actually, it turns out they like the other candidate, and maybe they're going to vote for the other candidate. We didn't realize that. What? I thought you were on my team, man. And so our kidneys get stimulated, right? And that kidney yang gets stimulated, which is going to provoke some kind of response, right? You could think of this as the kind of fight or flight sort of energy, the basis of the fight or flight sort of energy. In Chinese medicine, when the kidneys go on to affect the liver, right, in the five element cycle, the water, I won't draw it, but the water feeds the wood, right? So that kidney yang, if it feeds the liver yang, then we're going to kind of go into fight mode a little bit. Although it could also be flight mode, right? The kidneys can freeze. With this metaphor of the kidneys being water, right? The kidneys can kind of contract and freeze in place. So these are different manifestations of that kind of way that the kidneys are being stimulated. And you can even, if you really tune into your body, I find that I can even feel this. I'm curious if other people can too. When you feel threatened in this particular way, there's almost something around the low back that just goes like that pushes or sort of gets stimulated. This is the kidney region in Chinese medicine. The kidneys are linked with what's called Mingmen, which is this region of the low back, or more specifically a point, an acupuncture point that's under L2. Yeah, this kidney yang is going to be stimulated, and the spine in Chinese medicine, the dumai is the channel that runs along the spine, is the sea of yang, and so it is basically that yang qi kind of travels through the spine, and the nervous system is stimulated. Basically, the central nervous system is stimulated, and yeah, and that's kidney yang. That's our survival instinct. Now, what we also need in order to be healthy, of course, is the kidney yin, and the kidney yin is linked with rest. It's what allows us to rest, to calm down, to sync the energy in our bodies. Right, the movement of qi, essentially related to the water phase, is a syncing energy. And so the kidney yin is really important to balance out the kidney yang. And the kidneys, by the way, are considered the most yin viscera. So it's especially important to protect the yin of the kidneys. It's why the kidneys are especially sensitive in the wintertime, which is the most yin time of the year. the wintertime is also the time of the year associated with the water phase. And it is at this time that we want to protect the kidneys most, meaning that we are wanting to minimize how much the yang of the kidneys is drawn on, right? We don't want to be in survival mode all the time during the winter, especially if it's cold and the days are short. We want to be resting a lot more. And of course, rest is one of the big sort of remedies if we are stuck in an overly yang state with regards to the kidneys. If we're stuck in this survival mode, this kind of fight or flight survival mode. So a few things that happen here, or one thing that can go wrong, right? Of course, we need the yin and the yang. There's nothing wrong with that yang survival response, right? It keeps us alive. There's nothing wrong with it. But when it gets out of balance, there's a problem. And for a lot of people, myself included sometimes, this yang gets overly stimulated, and people can find themselves in a kind of hyper-stimulated, overly kind of hyper-vigilant state where the yang can't be grounded and returned to the yin. And that's a really big problem. And the problem with too much of this yang is that over time it will burn up yin because of the intertransformation of yin and yang, right? This diagram shows many different principles, and one of the principles it shows is that if there is too much yang, it will consume the yin. If there's too much yin, it will consume the yang. And so, for instance, if there's too much yin, if someone in their lifestyle is just resting and sleeping all the time and not doing anything, that's going to consume the yang, right? Soon enough, their body isn't producing enough energy, right? Or if someone is overly yang, right, they're never sleeping, they're taking stimulants all the time, they're going crazy, then it's going to be really, really hard to rest and calm down and calm the mind. And so I think arguably, our culture as a whole tends to be yang excess, although it's not a healthy form of yang, right? A healthy form of yang in Chinese medicine is connected to the soul and spirit, essentially. It's the healthy yang is a profound thing, but what we have is a kind of fake sort of yang, in the same way that electric lighting is a fake version of the sun. We have sort of that. We have a lot of that. We have a lot of kind of jitteriness, and what that really is in Chinese medicine is heat. So the heat and sometimes wind, but really heat being the kind of yang pathogen that's produced but when we don't have enough yin, which is kind of the coolant for the system. So this is the problem, right? It can become a vicious cycle, and because the kidneys are linked with survival, when we're put into survival mode, our tendency is to do behaviors which are linked with just surviving, right? And when we're just concerned with surviving, we're not usually thinking about the long term. We're not usually thinking about, what our body or our mind or our life needs for the next 10 years of life, right? We're overly emotional, and we're not thinking clearly, right? Fear is one of the biggest draws on our willpower, right? In Chinese medicine, the zhi, the will, is connected to the kidneys, which basically indicates that to the extent that we are caught in fear, we have less willpower. And this is obviously the case. If we're feeling scared all the time, and it's hard to exercise will over our lives. And so what we have is this cycle that people can easily get caught in, where their yang is being stimulated all the time. They're not able to calm and settle with the yin because they end up getting caught in this sort of fear survival based thing. And the tricky thing about survival based actions, if we get stuck in that, is that they can start to sort of sabotage our life. I'll explain how that's the case. So one teacher of Chinese medicine who I studied with for a long time would talk about the alarm bell of the kidneys, that they're sort of the water element, and actually the bladder especially, which is linked with the kidneys. In this case, I'm using kidney and bladder together, even though they're different zongfu. They are part of one system, which is the water system of the body, and they are linked with they have this ability to kind of ring the alarm. So when something is happening for us that is really not okay, that feels like it's threatening our survival, there's this alarm that rings inside of us, right? Which is that kidney yang being sparked, right? There's alarm, right? The tricky thing is when we bypass and don't listen to that alarm bell, which there's a tendency to do, especially if we are overstimulated. If we're overstimulated, which means that our system is constantly, the kidney yang is constantly being stimulated, then we can kind of get used to being in that state. And so we don't realize that things are happening in our lives that actually make us feel fear, and not just fear, right? But they stimulate that survival thing, right? They're not quite right for us, and this is the problem. This is one of the big problems that can occur with the kidneys, is that when something happens that rings this alarm in the system, and we go into a state of alarm, if we do not deal with that and return our system back to a yin, calm, centered state, if we stay in that state of alarm for too long, it starts to become our baseline, right? And the kidney, a disruption of kidney yang and yin occurs. In one tradition of Chinese medicine, this is very much associated with the Luo system, the Luo points. The low point of the kidney is right around the ankle, and kidney lows are associated with things that sort of stimulate this alarm for us, but we don't listen to. The bladder lows also. And so things that kind of threaten our survival, our sense of self, our sense of our drive and our willpower, if we do not heed the call of our body when we're put into that alarmed state, then we can end up paying the price, because we end up in a more and more hypervigilant state, basically, unable to calm down. And so I was thinking about this, just thinking about my friend who got in touch with me, and how tricky this can be, because often our strategies, people's strategies for dealing with this survival situation end up creating more survival situations in the future, right? Because short-term, heavily emotional ways of relating end up creating the conditions and the patterns for that, right? People often experience this with sexuality, especially men and women do, right? Where they their kidneys are stimulated through a sexual experience, and that depletes the kidney yin a little bit. At least it would for a man, not for a woman. And then they find themselves being stimulated more and more by the yang. So that can become a vicious cycle. That's more for men, but certainly for everyone, sex and survival instincts are closely related. And so another thing that can happen is, in Chinese medicine, a tendency towards secrecy is often associated with the water element, the kidneys being the most yin and the most kind of hidden, and a tendency to lie. And this is a pretty common thing that is adopted as a survival strategy by people. Unfortunately, lying about things tends to put us in more kind of binds in our lives, relational binds, that put us in more situations where we feel, I don't want to get caught. I don't want to get in trouble. I need to protect myself. I need to survive. So then I lie again, and that'll just create more and more of these situations for people where they're caught in a survival state. So the one thing that my friend mentioned was, thinking about just leaving society for a little bit and doing their own thing, which could be a skillful way of dealing with things. It could not be. You never know. But certainly when this alarm bell has rung, it is important to step back from whatever it is that keeps ringing it, get out of that state, and go yin again. Calm the system down before returning to whatever it is in one's life that is stimulating it. The very hard thing is when people have had these alarm bells triggered at young ages through different circumstances in their lives. Things happened that were not okay, that were not right for them, traumatic experiences, and they've never really fully experienced what it's like to be calm and to be yin. And so their lives, because of that, their lives end up being constant repetitions of this survival pattern. Oh, am I still here? There I am. Yeah. So that's very tricky, right? And that's not uncommon with trauma, basically, is to constantly have this stimulated. I just saw that my computer's about to die, so I will have to wrap this up, even though I have a lot more to say, but that's fine. I've been talking for a little bit, and I can return to this another time. Um, things that really are important for the kidneys, right? Getting rest, going yin at the yin times to make sure that they don't get overstimulated in this way, and to make sure that we are not bypassing the alarm bell. One misunderstanding I have had in the past, and I see many people have this misunderstanding, is about the way to deal with or conquer fear, because it's easy to think of conquering fear as basically, oh, I'm just going to brace against this alarm bell, basically, and override it. And that is usually not skillful. If our system has gone so far that we are in that alarmed state, that is not actually conquering fear to just ignore it and push on anyway. If the alarm bell continues to ring, right, that isn't actually conquering fear. Conquering fear is fear arising, the alarm bell ringing, and then releasing that fear, right? Releasing that fear, that's conquering fear, right? But it's easy to think, oh, I'm going to move through my fear simply by just every time that alarm bell rings and puts me in the survival situation, to just say, screw it, I'll just go more into the survival situation. That doesn't work. Usually there are times when it can, right, when that response actually sparks the kidney yang to such a great extent that the yang just pushes through and then pushes through the stagnation of the actual situation, and then we feel stronger for it. But if it is a situation that is continually provoking the alarm, then if we can't kind of push through it with that spark of kidney yang and then get out of the survival situation so that we can then rest, if our pushing into it is just pushing into a what feels like a constant survival situation, the most skillful thing is to retreat for a moment, settle down the kidneys, and then come back to it, if that makes sense, right? The reason we have the kidney yang is to help us push through fear, basically, to push through and deal with and kind of tackle something and deal with something that feels like it's threatening our survival. If we are for some reason unable to do that, though, if we're in a situation perhaps where it's constantly being triggered or it's not able to be conquered in that way, so that then we can return after dealing with the survival situation to a safe, restful state, then the best thing is to just go, okay, wait, I'm going to go to a safe, restful state, and then I'll come back to it. So anyway, there's some thoughts about the alarm bell of the kidneys, and